Mr. President, I am going to be offering a little bit later this afternoon a motion to instruct conferees in connection with the tax bill. It may be one of the most simple, straightforward motions ever offered in this body. I can read it in its entirety. We move that the managers on the part of the Senate at the conference on the disagreeing votes of the two houses on the bill H.R. 1 be instructed to insist that the final conference report not increase the federal budget deficit for the period of fiscal years 2018 through 2027. Couldn't be more straightforward. Don't increase the budget deficit. Why? Well, this chart basically tells the story. We are headed into literally uncharted territory with regard to our national debt. It is a threat to this country. It's a threat to our national security. It's a threat to every man, woman, and especially child, because they're the people that are going to have to be paying this debt. This is a history of our debt in constant dollars going all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and it tells a very powerful story. At the very beginning of our country, 1790, a big piece of debt to pay for the Revolutionary War. They paid it off. Another mountain of debt to pay for the Civil War. It was paid off. The debt goes up again to pay for World War I, and it was paid off. And then it goes up for the Depression, and then to a peak in World War II. But what happened after World War II? As we all know, World War II was fought. Our country was defended. Victory was achieved by something that's been called the Greatest Generation. And the Greatest Generation paid their bills. They paid off the debt from World War II. It went down in the 70s and then back up again in the 80s. And here's where we are today. And the bill that was passed in the dead of night, early Saturday morning, adds $1.5 trillion to that debt. $1.5 trillion we're adding to the debt at a time of low unemployment, enormous growth in the stock market, and a relatively strong economy. Not perfect by any means, but compared with where we were 5 or 6 years ago, we're in positive territory on the economy. That's when you should pay down debt, not add to it unnecessarily. If we were in a crisis, if we were in a recession, if we were in a conflict that required an immediate mobilization, that's when you want to add to the debt. That's what you borrow for. We're borrowing to pay park ranger salaries. We're borrowing to do the ordinary operation of government, and now we're borrowing to give major tax cuts in a time of relatively positive economic growth. And I know it's not as high as it should be and as high as we want it to be, but this bill that we passed that's going to add to the debt isn't going to do much of anything to assist us with growth. The analysis of the Joint Taxation Committee is it will add 0.8% to GDP growth in 10 years. That's almost immeasurable. 0.8% in 10 years. It doesn't come close, by the way, to paying for itself. It doesn't come close, maybe 15 or 20%. And by the way, that's an interesting number because all the studies that I've seen about tax cuts and their effect on economic growth is they do about 20% of their cost. The other 80% is eaten by our kids. It's unethical what we're doing. If 5-year-olds knew what we were doing and could vote, we would all be out of a job. Because they are the ones that are going to have to pay this bill. And to see this mountain climbing, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see that we're going to be higher than at World War II in a matter of a few years, added to by this bill that we just passed the other night, it's unconscionable. It's unnecessary. If indeed we were going to expand the economy 3 or 4% a year, and everybody says that's what we're going for, maybe, okay? But that 3% a year times 10, that's 30% growth. But we're talking about 0.8 of 1% over 10 years, not per year, over 10 years. So my motion is very, very simple. Don't come back with a bill that adds to the deficit. And there are lots of ways we can do tax reform. There are lots of ways we can cut corporate taxes, make ourselves more competitive. We can do offshore tax cuts. There's lots of ability to do this without hammering the deficit. In fact, I understand as of this morning, we improved the finances of this bill by mistake to the tune of $389 billion, a mistake in the bill that we passed, because we did it so fast that nobody knew what was in it. I have a new rule. The faster a bill goes through the United States Congress, the worse it is. And I think that's what we've seen in this case. We can deal with tax reform. We can increase our competitiveness. We can get our taxes aligned, particularly our business taxes, with the rest of the world without loading this debt onto our children. A tax cut when all you're doing is borrowing to fill the hole is not a cut. It is a shift of the tax from you to your kids. You're on your deathbed, you're lying there, and you say to your children, come on over, I'll give you my last words. And they come over and they're listening, they want wisdom. What you say is, here's the credit card, we had a great trip to Acapulco, you can pay for it. That's not responsible, nobody would do that. But that's exactly what we're doing in this bill. It's wrong, and it's not necessary. It's not necessary. And I think one of the questions that we're going to have to ask and answer, and we're going to see it, it's going to play out, is what are companies going to do with this newfound income when the taxes are cut dramatically from 35% to 20%? Is that money going to go into new plant and equipment? Is it going to go into wages? Is it going to increase people's wages, productivity? Or is it going to go into stock buybacks, which raise the value of the stock? That's great for the owners, but that doesn't do a thing for the workers, and it doesn't do much for the United States economy. So again, my motion couldn't be more straightforward and simple. Work on the tax bill in conference. I think you're going to have a hard time making a good bill out of it. But whatever you do, come back with something that's deficit neutral. And by the way, that's where this discussion started. Last January, the leadership in both houses and in both parties was talking about deficit neutral tax reform. And somewhere along the way, it became, let's break the bank. Let's add new debt to our kids. Let's create a situation where we're not going to have any slack when we need it. No business would run this way, and it's wrong for us to try to run the country this way. So, Mr. President, I'm going to make this motion. I hope that my colleagues, many of whom on both sides of the aisle have been talking to me and to the country for years about the dangers of the deficit, and they're suddenly, I predict, if this bill becomes law, about the time the ink is dry, they're going to say, oh, my Lord, we have a deficit. Look at that. I didn't know that. And we're going to have to cut spending. We're going to have to cut Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, because we have this huge deficit. Well, we don't have to add to it and make it worse in this tax bill. And that's what's really bothering me, because the very people who have been talking to me and I've been listening to for 20 years about how serious the deficit is, I was fool enough to believe them. I think it is a serious problem, and I think we need to address it. But this is the opposite of addressing it. We're making it worse at the very time we should be talking about paying down the debt, not adding to it. Mr. President, we can do better. The American people expect more of us. We can do better, and I believe and deeply hope that we will come to our senses and do better in connection with this bill.